song before the sermon is preached to us this morning? 622. 622. There's a message true and glad for the sinful and the sad. Ring it out, ring it out. It will give him courage new, it will help him to be true. Ring it out, ring it out, ring out the word or land. Still far from Jesus, many living sick and down. Ring out the news that makes men free to all the lost of every nation. Tell the word of saving grace, make it known in every place. Ring it out, ring it out. Help the needy ones to know him from whom the blessings flow. Ring it out, ring it out, ring out the word or land and sea. Still far from Jesus, many living sick and down. Ring out the news that makes men free to all the lost of every nation. With a message out, sending out to sleep away till shall dawn the better day. Ring it out, ring it out, till the sinful world be won for Jehovah's mighty Son. Ring it out, ring it out, ring out the word or land and sea. Still far from Jesus, many living sick and down. Ring out the news that makes men free to all the lost of every nation. Ring message out. Good morning. I appreciate Michael picking up on The Great Escape. It's one of my friends and I, our favorite movie. I used to play it on Saturdays at the youth center that we would go to. It was a movie based on a true story of prisoners of war during World War II that worked together and created a great escape. And I thought it was a good title for a lot of the things that God has done for us all throughout history. If you read through the Bible, I even had a series of lessons on great escapes. You're thinking about how it seems impossible to us, but with God all things are possible. Noah and the ark, that was a great escape, at least for 8 people, and quite a few of the animals. Abraham escaped from a land of worshiping other gods to the one true God, came to the one true land. Today, talking about the Exodus, that was a great escape. Most powerful nation in the world, and God showed His power and brought them liberation and freedom. And time of Hezekiah, the Assyrian army was camped all around him. And the next morning, most of them were dead. A great escape. And the one that's coming, which we'll talk about in a little bit, one that's in process right now, one that the Exodus foreshadowed and pretty much symbolized the next great escape that we're all involved in right now. I can say a little bit more about that a little bit later. This month we're looking at how God, through His Spirit, empowered certain people under the first covenant. It was specific times, specific places, specific people for temporary jobs. We know in the New Testament, which we'll look at next week, God pours out His Spirit on all those who are redeemed by the blood of Christ. And so it's a complete blanketing. Under the Old Testament, though, He showed His power at certain times, at certain places, with certain people when it was necessary. And it brought about faith, and it brought about God's plans. And the Exodus is just one of those events, probably the most visible one. The great escape, the Exodus. And you read about the Exodus in the Old Testament books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua. Because it really was not complete until they were home in the promised land. And that's the part for us that's still left open. We have not reached our land of promise just yet. We're getting there. We are right now in the form of an Exodus. God's Spirit was the one working to bring about Israel's freedom. Freedom from a physical slavery. We know now it's a spiritual slavery. That sin has trapped us. We are held by our sin, not by Satan. Remember, Satan doesn't own anything. It's our sin. And we have to release it. Let it go, and only through God, through Jesus, are we able to do that, to win our freedom. Biblical words that are used in Hebrew, especially since the time of the Exodus, God uses these different words about what He had done for His people throughout the Old Testament time. Liberation. He liberated them. They were free. He used the word redemption. I redeemed you. I did this for you. The idea of redemption is to buy the release of a prisoner of another country that had captured him. And they would pay a ransom price. And then, I don't know how you would feel. For me, I would owe my life to that person who had paid the redemption price. And God says, I redeemed you. I'm the one that brought you out of Egypt. And therefore, He was a bit offended when the people didn't provide their lives for Him afterwards. It was also a rescue. The idea of salvation in the New Testament, the language is that of a rescue, where God comes to rescue us. And today, we've been justified freely by the blood of Christ, but we're awaiting our final rescue. It's when Jesus comes back to take us home. Right now, think of ourselves in a lifeboat on the waves, waiting for the rescue ship to come and get us. That's the wording of salvation. Also during the time of the Exodus, God rescued His people. Also the time of deliverance. He delivered them, picked them up, and brought them safely to their destination. So all throughout the Old Testament, God is reminding them of how He's done each of these things and many more for them. And it was His Spirit who gets the power and the credit for the power of her doing that for them. It was the Spirit who was the power, providing God's purpose, bringing it all about, enabling the people who were involved. Because God did it through two different means. And I give you there on your outline today, and if you don't have an outline, I think there's more on the back table inside your bulletin. What color are they today? Purple? Lavender? Lilac? Okay. Us guys, we can say purple. Okay. The first way he worked his power was through miraculous events. Miracles. Once-in-a-lifetime occurrences. A lot of critics of the Bible try to explain these as natural occurrences that just happened at that time period. That's quite a coincidence for all of them, because they started when God through Moses or Aaron said they would, and they ended when God said they would. And those things don't just happen by coincidence. That proved the miracles behind it. First of all were the plagues. 10 natural disasters that God brought about and heightened them, increased their intensity. Though there was no question then as to what happened. The first couple, Pharaoh's magicians were able to imitate, but by the third one, his magician said, let him go, this has got power of God. Yeah. But this was a stubborn Pharaoh. God needed a Pharaoh who was so stubborn he would wait out 10 of them. 10 was the complete number, a symbolic number. And even after 10, he still broke down and went after him again, didn't he? That was a stubborn dude. Yeah. But the nation of Egypt was completely destroyed, including at the end their army. The plagues were the power of God to enhance his power. And they were all aimed, according to what he says in some of the prophets, they were all aimed at the gods that the Egyptians worshipped. They worshipped the Nile River, turned to blood. They worshipped the creatures in the Nile River. They came up and infested their houses. And they worshipped the sun, total darkness. A darkness, it says, it could be felt. All of those were God's direct power over any of the gods that people put up there and worship. Showed his power over that. And they were so impressive. They weren't just for the Egyptians. The Israelites were reminded about them. And then when they got into Canaan, the Canaanites just heard about it. And Rahab says, our hearts are melting with fear. And they just heard about it. So they were very impressive, which tells you they weren't just natural occurrences. Also through the Red Sea, they walked through on dry ground. And I don't know about you, I've said this many times, I still feel this way. I get this wall of water on both sides, I'm not going in there. But if I've got an Egyptian army behind me that's mean and angry and carrying swords, all right. See, sometimes God allows bad things to happen to get us to move, doesn't he? And they got through on dry ground. And they were known then as river crossers after that. A rock, a strange rock. Water came out of it. Paul will say in his letter to the 1 Corinthians that was Christ. That was God in a physical manifestation, following the people, providing them with water, so that Jesus, just before he was crucified on one of the festivals that celebrated the Exodus, says, I am the water of life. Also the manna literally means in Hebrew, what is it? They picked it up off the ground. They'd never seen it before, and they never saw it again after. And so they called it, what is it? It was manna, bread from heaven. Later on, Jesus will claim, I am the bread of life, equating himself again with the Exodus event. There was fire that stood between them and the Egyptians until it was dry ground to walk across. But the fire then followed them at night, give them light, to keep them warm. There was a cloud, a very strange cloud, not a usual one. Covered them during the day to protect them from the heat of the sun, but yet it moved out in front of them so that they would follow it through this barren wasteland and know which way to go. Yeah, there was the law. Not necessarily miraculous, except that for the Canaanites, Israel's God was hard to defeat because he told them how to live, how to behave. Idolatry that a lot of people even practice still today without realizing it, just trial and error. You got to figure it out for yourself. But God told them exactly what to do. And He said, the other nations around you are going to call you blessed. What other nation has such wonderful laws to follow? Today we see them as restrictive, don't we? We think God's keeping us from having fun. And yet God's given us the guidelines to stay on track and make sure our journey is successful in life. Sometimes we just got to change the way we think about His law. The priesthood. God ordained a special group of guys to stand in between so He could minister, so they could provide sacrifices, so they could bless the people. God provided all of that for them. That was His Spirit that empowered and enabled all of these things. All of these, the Spirit provided for all of their needs. The other way in which He acted was He worked through human agents. And He still does that today, doesn't He? Yes. His answer to prayer can sometimes, well, most times be through other people. Sometimes He wants you to help answer that prayer on behalf of other people. Sometimes He uses us. Sometimes He uses other people. Human agents. God is not above doing that. And so three of them during the Exodus account, three of the major ones, but they're not the only ones. First one is the main man, Moses. Moses. As you remember, now you read the Hebrews 11 account, you compare it to the Exodus account, and it looks like two different guys, doesn't it? In Hebrews, he's strong and courageous. Yet in Exodus, he was afraid. He didn't want to go back to Egypt. He's a wanted man there. He had bad memories. He's settled down. He's become a shepherd. He's got a family. I don't need to leave here. I got everything I need right here. 80 years old. That's retirement age. And yet God hadn't even begun working through him. He was afraid. He was skeptical. Yeah, if people aren't going to listen to me, I can't talk. I can't talk well. We get the idea that he stuttered from that, but really, I'm not a public speaker. I've never learned to stand in front of people. But I'll speak through you. See, God always takes away our excuses, doesn't He? And He was very uncertain. You know, I go back there and which God? Which God they're going to ask me? Which God? Because they've been there for 400 years. They were influenced to the Egyptian. All they knew about their God was that He was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's all they knew. Which God? Because the Egyptians worshipped a whole bunch. And God says, I am the only one. I am the eternal one. I am has sent me to you. But He was still, remember, He says, oh, please, send somebody else. He didn't want the job, did He? And for the first couple of plagues, He did take a background stand. However, once He saw God working, you never heard about His mouthpiece after that. It was Moses, the man of God, who never, well, a few times looked back. This is what we find in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11 is looking at Moses as how he became. And that's the God that we serve. He's not looking at us as we are right now. He even named Simon Peter, looking forward to what Simon would become. And that's the same with us. He sees our potential and calls us accordingly. Hebrews 11, by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now again, you see, this is after. Because at the time period, he was all about that. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. Again, afterwards. After he became what God knew he could be. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. He didn't know about Christ. But Jesus was there, wasn't He? being the eternal part of the Godhead, Jesus was there. Paul made that rock one of the ways in which God provided. Jesus Christ, the Son, was there. Moses appreciated that. He was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who was invisible. Just by definition, if it's invisible, you can't see it. So how did Moses see him? Not with the physical eye, but with the eyes of faith. He saw how God had worked. He saw how God had been moving things into place. And after the second or third plague, he didn't need help anymore. He was God's man after that. Now, after seeing God, all of the fear, the skepticism, the uncertainty, the ignorance, it all melted away. And by ignorant, I don't mean stupid. I just mean he hadn't learned yet. We learn by experience. Our faith is based by our walk with Christ and God. He hadn't done that yet. But after he got on the road with God, he was God's man. And the same is true for us today. And also, God provided assistance for him. Provided Aaron to speak for him. But he also he took his father-in-law's advice and had other judges help him decide cases. This one that I give to you here in Numbers chapter 11, Moses again said, the work is just too much. I need help. And so God says, I'll take this of the spirit that's on you and I'll place it on these other guys. And it was only temporary. They prophesied, but it didn't happen again. And what it did was to show the people that these people were selected by God to help Moses. Because none of us can do this alone. We all get worn out. We all need help. And life now, and the wisdom of the church, is the idea that it's a collective. It's never a one-man show. It's never meant for just a few. If we're not all together in this, we're not going anywhere. And so Moses even had assistants to help him. The other human agent is Aaron, Moses' brother. Aaron was Moses' spokesman at first, wasn't he? When Moses said, please, send somebody else, and the anger of God said, all right, fine. Aaron's on his way here. He'll talk for you. You'll be God to Pharaoh, but he'll be your mouthpiece. That must have looked really silly. Moses standing there, and Aaron talking for him. But it didn't last but a little while. When Moses got his courage, you don't hear about Aaron speaking anymore. And actually, Aaron got in trouble for ridiculing him later on. So, Aaron, the older brother even, took a sidestep because Moses was God's man, and he took over. In Numbers chapter 17, there was a story where the other Levites revolted. I used to really fear and be upset for the priests because, you know what, they didn't get to choose that. They were born into it. They had to be. And the Levites had to be the assistants. They didn't have a choice. Well, suppose they wanted to be a carpenter. Suppose they wanted to make pottery. Well, they couldn't. They were chosen to be priests and assistants. And yet, when you read through the account, I've changed my mind on that. They had the best deal there. Because not all the sacrifices were all burned up. With some of them, many of them, the choice cuts of meat were given to the priest and the assistants and their family. They got the good food. And the grain offerings and the drink offerings that were provided, they were for the priest and his family to support them so they could do the work full time. Now I can start to see how the others would start saying, hey, wait a second, I want to do that. Dathan and Abiram led a revolt. And God had a little exercise for them to do so that wouldn't happen again. One choice from each of the tribes, one of the leaders, would bring his staff. And they put it inside the tent of testimony. Aaron's was for the tribe of Levi. And God was going to show them which one he chose as being the high priest. And that's here in Numbers chapter 17. It starts verse 6. Actually, it starts before that, but you can read that when you go home. Moses spoke to the Israelites. Their leaders gave him 12 staffs, one for the leader of each of their ancestral tribes, and Aaron's staff was among them. Moses placed the staffs before the Lord in the tent of the covenant of law. The next day, Moses entered the tent and saw that Aaron's staff, which represented the tribe of Levi, had not only sprouted, but had budded, blossomed, and produced almonds. Any question as to which one God chose? See, God never gives you just enough, does He? He always goes way above and beyond. Aaron's rod, his stick, turned into a tree and even produced fruit. Just by happenstance? Coincidence? Maybe his was in the fertilizer inside. Overnight. There was no question afterwards. And according to some histories and reports at the time, that was one of the articles inside the Ark of the Covenant to be displayed as a constant reminder that God chose Aaron's family. And that, going back here to the outline then, God chose his family, Aaron's family, to represent him. But Aaron was not perfect, was he? Remember the calf? Kind of lost control of the people there with the golden calf, didn't he? But God did not take away his choice. Aaron obviously repented. He was still God's man. Even though he failed, God was willing to forgive. Aaron and his sons were the priests after that. The Levites were the assistants. Aaron's sons continued all the way till the time of Jesus, even until Jesus became the great high priest in fulfillment of Aaron's family. And in Numbers chapter 6, God had them bless the people. Numbers chapter 6, they spoke a blessing. And to the Hebrew mindset, words were active. They did things. And so in speaking a blessing to you, those words would invisibly stick to you. And then they would protect you as you went through the day. Protect you against harm from Satan, from evil. They'd be reminders for you if you remember the blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord turn His face to you and shine upon you and give you peace. So as the people then would leave to their daily chores, God's blessing stuck to them. And it was the priests, the sons of Aaron. They were to bless God's people. That's a wonderful thing, isn't it? That God would not leave you alone, but have you a constant reminder of His blessing. The Spirit empowered Moses to do what he had to do. The Spirit empowered Aaron to be the mediator. The Spirit also empowered Joshua. Yeshua is how they pronounced it. Later on, centuries later, a little kid would be born with the same name, transliterated by the Greek as Jesus, but coming from the same Hebrew name as Yeshua, which means God save us. Salvation. Bring us blessing. He was mentored by Moses. He was Moses' aide. Moses was the master. Joshua was his apprentice. Joshua even accompanied him on the mountain when Moses went to get the law. No one else was allowed to touch the mountain. Joshua went with him. He was able to. It was like an extension of Moses. So he was with Moses as God was working through him. He was with Moses through all of those wilderness campaigns. He was also the commander of Israel's army. He was the leader when the other nations would not allow them to pass but came out and attacked them. It was Joshua who was given command of the army. And later on, he worked that command. He and Caleb were the only ones that brought a faithful report when they spied out the land of Canaan. Joshua represented the tribe of Ephraim. Caleb, the tribe of Judah. Everyone else said, oh, those people are big. Their cities are big too. We don't have any battering rams. We don't have any weapons. We can't beat them. It was Caleb who stood up and said, wait a second. You remember what we've just been through? Joshua stood with him. They wanted to kill Joshua and Caleb until God stepped in and protected them. So Joshua was the perfect one to take Moses' place. Except that if you read the first chapter of the book that bears Joshua's name, you get the impression that Joshua wasn't sure if he could. God gave him courage. Moses' shoes would have been extremely huge to fill, wouldn't they? So after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people, get ready to cross the river, Jordan River, into the land I'm about to give them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. Here, it appears to me, is what gave Joshua his courage, though. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. And that's all Joshua needed. When he heard that, he got the commanders of the army together and said, get them ready, let's go, we're ready to go. And with one short little hiccup, Joshua never looked back. As I was with Moses, so I'll be with you. And you know, Jesus said the same thing just before going back to God. I will never leave you nor forsake you. I will be with you to the very end of the age. Amen. Same thing God told Joshua. And yet we doubt. We fear. We have trouble trusting. Not Joshua. In his farewell address in chapter 24 of the book of Joshua, we see that he was fully committed to doing God's will. Make a choice today, Joshua says there, Joshua 24. You can serve the gods beyond the river that Abraham served, or you can serve the Egyptian gods that you come to learn to serve. But as for me and my house, we're serving Yahweh. Amen. Great passage of Scripture. Great statement of faith. And God calls us to the same statement today. Before you were baptized, what commitment did you make? What was your confession? Hopefully it was like Joshua. As for me and my house, we're serving Yahweh. That's the confession he's looking for. That's what's called the Great Confession in the New Testament. We're following God. And God's man today, similar name as Yeshua, Joshua, Jesus, Jesus. Same guy. See how it all relates. See how the whole event was a foreshadowing of what we're going through today. And it was the Spirit of God who helped them and still help us today through our Exodus event. It was the Spirit who enabled them to survive. They should have died in the wilderness. There was nothing there. It was the perfect place to have all this world's wealth and not be able to do anything with it. They didn't have to work for their food. They went out and picked it up off the ground. My mother told me that food doesn't grow on trees. And I believed her. Yet in the Exodus, all they had to do was pick it up off the ground. And they still had trouble with that. God was with them every step of the way to help them survive through that event. And it was 40 years. You after 10 years, manna you'd start getting tired of the manna, wouldn't you? And they begged for meat. God gave them meat. He still provided for them every step of the way. It was God's Spirit who enabled them to succeed. He gave them the strength to stand against their enemies and to win. And finally, most importantly, still today, it's the Spirit of God who enables us to mature and to grow in our faith. Our faith is not what it needs to be. Even the Apostle Paul says, I don't have it yet. I'm still striving, pushing forward. We can never stop. We are always in process. And that's the work of the Spirit within us today. So this next great escape is the resurrection to eternal life. That's the next one that we're all right now involved in. We're leaving our bondage to sin. We are now in a wilderness. The poets, many poets have said it's a jungle out there. And it is, isn't it? Our world is a dangerous place. And there are no guarantees here. And the only way we're going to survive is with God's help. And none of us are getting out of here alive. And so we need to persevere, to keep striving, to keep growing. And our challenge is, the other people around us who are doing what is not right, they look big, don't they? They're very strong, aren't they? And they're surviving just fine. That's what it looks like. They make a lot of money. They have a lot of nice things. They appear to be having all the fun. But do we realize that it's just for a short time? That inside they're dying? And so were we. No, we need God's Spirit continually to help us face these giants so that we persevere, so that we do not bring a bad report, because we do not want to die in this wilderness. We want to be carried across into the new promised land. That's the next great escape. Paul mentions a little bit about that in Romans chapter 8. The great chapter on the Spirit of the Bible. The Spirit of God. The one who inspired the Scriptures so that we would have the information, and now who leads the way, helping us, motivating us, urging us to practice what it says. He says, if Christ is in you, inside, not just in your mind or on your heart, but in you, literally inside of you, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, the Spirit gives life because of righteousness. Remember, it's not our practice, it's not our performance. It's our attitude, it's our heart, it's our mind, it's our faith. Faith leading to the action. The righteousness, doing what's right because we know it's right. If you have to ask, then you really don't know, do you? God built it in you to know what was right. And if the Spirit of Him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, the same Spirit, He who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of the Spirit who lives in you. That's the work of the Spirit today. That's why we need Him. Yes. The same one who led the way through the Exodus before, the first great escape, the next great escape is still there. He's doing the same thing. He's guiding us in the same way. God's Spirit continues to work for our spiritual freedom. Amen. And it's not an all one-time event, is it? No. It's a lifelong process. It'd be nice if it was just he'd done. No more problems, no more trouble. No, we have to go through the wilderness. We have to face our thirst and wonder where God's rock is going to be. We have to wonder where our next meal is going to come from, but God will have us pick it up off the ground. We'll have the shielding of the cloud, protection of the fire. God's law to guide us every step of the way. Paul calls that process sanctification. It comes from the word of holy, to be holified, sanctus. And it's a process that never ends. He says it's for those who are being saved. We're maturing to be like Jesus. The process of sanctification is being less like the world and more like Christ. And it's going to be a roller coaster. But what God looks at is the intent. He looks at the faith. He looks at the desire. And He looks at the action that's motivated by the faith. Where is your faith leading you today? If you're not following the Spirit, you're in the gutter. You're in the ditch. You're stuck in the mud. You're headed down a pathway that leads to nowhere. God is calling you back to Himself. Calling you back through Christ to get back on track with the Spirit. And repentance doesn't mean try to head Him off at the past. It means going back where you messed up and getting it solved, getting it back on track, and going on from there. And as long as you're on that path, walking in the light as He's in the light, the blood of Christ continues to cleanse you. 1 John 1:7. That's where God wants you to be, because that way God knows you're headed to the promised land. Where will you be for the next great escape? Will you be a doubter or a believer? Will you be a Joshua and a Caleb? Even Moses failed to make it to the promised land because his temper got the best of him. Don't let that happen to you. Today, while we sing this song that Greg has chosen, what number, Greg?
624.
624. This is an opportunity for prayers to get back on track, or to be baptized into Christ and begin your walk with Him. Whatever your need is today, don't leave today outside of God. Don't leave today in the ditch. Get back on the road with God. And if we can help you, then while we sing this song, we invite you to please come. Let's stand while we sing.